May 14, 2026, 2:47 a.m. Somewhere in the darkness of occupied Crimea, 6 men are not breathing. They are pressed into a drainage ditch 18 inches wide, cold water soaking through their gear, listening to the crunch of boots on gravel 12 meters above them. A Russian patrol, 4 soldiers. 1 dog has deviated from its scheduled route, not by accident. Someone changed the rotation. And now the entire operation, 18 months of intelligence work, 48 hours of repositioning, 6 lives, and the single most important target on Ukraine's Crimean strike list. All of it is sitting in a drainage ditch, not breathing. 22 minutes. That is how long it takes for the patrol to complete its deviation and return to pattern. 22 minutes of absolute stillness in freezing runoff water while shaped charges sit 300 meters away, already planted, waiting for a signal that cannot come until 6 men climb out of a ditch without making a sound. This is what GUR operations look like from the inside. Not movies, not briefings, drainage ditches at 2:47 in the morning. What happened next would erase a facility that had been launching Shahed drone attacks against Ukrainian cities every single night for the better part of 6 months. The hub near Dzhankoi, tucked inside a civilian logistics depot in northern Crimea, coordinated and routed dozens of Iranian supplied Shahed 136 airframes per week, a command and relay nerve center that Russian planners had, deliberately hidden behind civilian infrastructure, layered S-300 coverage, and a rotating 3-team security apparatus they believed was impenetrable. They were wrong. And the proof burned for 4 hours. I'm your host at Steelfront, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Today we're breaking down one of the most precisely executed deep penetration special forces operations of the entire conflict. A mission that combined 18 months of satellite intelligence, 48 hours of repositioning under occupation, 6 operators, 3 waves of shaped charges, and 22 agonizing minutes in a drainage ditch. To permanently silence a Shahed coordination hub that had been making Ukrainian nights a nightmare. Real tactics, real consequences. Steelfront. Let's go back to where this actually begins, not May 2026, much earlier. The Shahed problem had been evolving since the first Iranian-supplied drones began arriving in Russian inventories in autumn 2022. But by late 2025, the threat had changed in kind, not just degree. Russia was no longer simply launching waves of Shahed 136 airframes on predictable trajectories toward population centers. By October 2025, Ukrainian air defense analysts tracking intercept data began noticing a pattern, or rather, the deliberate absence of one. Attack vectors were rotating unpredictably. Launch windows were shifting within hours of being estimated. Swarm sizes were varying in ways that specifically challenged Ukrainian intercept math, forcing defenders to commit assets to smaller probing waves before the main body arrived. This was not random. This was coordination. Ukrainian General Staff analysis, corroborated by satellite imagery cross-referenced against signal intercept data, pointed to a centralized routing and command facility operating somewhere in northern Crimea. The facility was not a launch site. Its function was relay and coordination, the brain of the Shahed network, not the fists. It received targeting data, distributed route packages to drone operators scattered across multiple launch sites, managed electronic jamming windows to suppress Ukrainian air defense radar at critical moments, and coordinated timing across simultaneous attack vectors to maximize saturation. Taking out individual launch sites was useful but not sufficient. This facility was the reason those launch sites were effective. By December 2025, imagery analysis had narrowed the location to a corridor in Dzhankoi district, northern Crimea. Signal intelligence triangulation further refined the target, and in January 2026, a satellite pass during a maintenance window at the suspected facility revealed thermal signatures consistent with a drone, assembly and preloading operation inside what publicly appeared to be a refrigerated logistics depot, the kind of facility whose civilian cover was just plausible enough to create legal and political friction around any strike. Russian planners had chosen the location carefully, too carefully, The specificity of the camouflage was itself a signal. GUR, Ukrainian military intelligence, opened a formal target development file on the facility in early January 2026. What followed was not a sprint. It was 4 months of patient, methodical intelligence accumulation that would eventually produce one of the most detailed target packages assembled for any single facility in the Crimea theater. Which weapon platform was most critical to making this operation possible? A. Satellite reconnaissance. B. Human intelligence assets inside Crimea. Or C. Signal intercept and triangulation. Comment your analysis below, because the answer is more layered than it first appears. The facility presented a specific problem that immediately ruled out conventional strike options. It was embedded inside a civilian logistics depot in a mixed-use commercial district of Dzhankoi. Storm Shadow cruise missiles could reach it. The British Split Scalp e.g. Storm Shadow had demonstrated a range in excess of 500 kilometers and a penetrating warhead capability against hardened structures. But using a cruise missile against a target inside a civilian facility in an urban district created exactly the kind of collateral damage attribution that Russian information warfare was built to exploit. Every civilian casualty in Crimea, regardless of cause, was processed through Russian state media as a Ukrainian war crime. Ukrainian planners knew this. Precision was not just operationally desirable, it was strategically mandatory. This meant the facility needed to be destroyed by people, not missiles. People who could place charges exactly where they needed to go. People who could do it quietly enough that the first indication anyone had of the operation was the secondary explosions of preloaded Shahed, airframes cooking off inside the storage bay. GUR had maintained a network of deep cover assets inside occupied Crimea since 2022. The details of that network are not publicly known and likely never will be, but what the subsequent operation demonstrated is that those assets were sophisticated, patient, and deeply familiar with the security patterns of Russian military installations across the peninsula. By February 2026, GUR case officers had accumulated a granular map of the Dzhankoi facility's security architecture, guard rotation schedules, all 3 teams, patrol routes and deviation frequencies, the location and type of perimeter sensors, the drainage infrastructure around the facility's eastern boundary, and crucially, a gap in the S-300 radar coverage created by terrain masking from an elevated rail embankment 2 kilometers to the northeast. That terrain gap was the operational keyhole. Low signature approach from the northeast through the radar shadow, across open steppe. The question was who would go through it. Here is the part that doesn't make sense on the surface, and yet it does, if you understand how GUR operates. The 6-man team designated for the Dzhankoi operation was not assembled and inserted specifically for this mission. They were already inside Crimea, positioned for a completely separate objective, the details of which remain classified. A GUR deep penetration unit had been operating inside occupied territory for weeks when the Dzhankoi targeting package reached maturity in early May 2026. GUR Command assessed the team's positioning, their current mission status, and the urgency of the Dzhankoi target, and made a decision that carries significant operational risk in any context. They redirected an active team mid-mission to a new objective under 48-hour notice. 48 hours to absorb a new target package. 48 hours to reposition from wherever they were to the northeastern approach corridor outside Dzhankoi. 48 hours to plan the breach, the placement sequence, the extraction route, and the contingencies. All without digital communication that could be intercepted, without physical reconnaissance of the final approach that might alert security, and without the ability to ask for clarification or additional intelligence once they were moving. The team leader, whose identity remains protected, reportedly acknowledged the redirect and requested one specific item: updated timing on the guard rotation for the facility's eastern perimeter. The request was fulfilled via an asset already on the ground in Dzhankoi district. The information came back within 6 hours. Guard rotation at the eastern perimeter, 3 a.m., then 3:45 a.m., then 4:30 a.m., 15-minute patrol cycle for each team, with a 22-minute gap in eastern sector coverage between each cycle. 22 minutes, the same number that would later define the most dangerous moment of the entire operation. Stay with me, because what happens in the next 40 minutes at that facility will determine whether Ukrainian cities sleep through the night or burn. The approach began at 11:30 p.m. on May 13, 2026. 6 operators, low-emission electric ATVs, moving northeast to southwest across open steppe terrain in a corridor that put them outside S-300 radar coverage. Electric ATVs were not selected for speed. They were selected for their acoustic signature, or rather the near absence of one. At distance, the sound profile of an electric motor at low speed is indistinguishable from ambient environmental noise, particularly on open steppe where wind creates constant acoustic interference. Russian perimeter sensors tuned for vehicle signatures would have nothing to detect. Thermal signatures were managed through gear selection and movement discipline. Operators spread across a wide lateral dispersion to minimize grouped heat signatures visible to any aerial surveillance asset that happened to be in the area. The ATVs were staged 2 kilometers from the perimeter and abandoned at 1:15 a.m. From that point, the team moved on foot across the final approach distance to the facility's northeastern boundary. What strikes me about this phase of the operation is how much everything depended on information that could not be directly verified in real time. The patrol schedules came from human intelligence that was, by definition, historical. The drainage corridor was identified in satellite imagery that was, by definition, two-dimensional and potentially outdated. The sensor layout on the perimeter was assessed, not confirmed. 6 men were walking toward a hardened military facility in occupied territory, trusting that 4 months of intelligence work had produced an accurate enough picture of the ground truth to keep them alive. That is a specific kind of courage that doesn't make headlines. The courage of trusting operations when you can no longer retreat into analysis. The drainage corridor on the facility's eastern boundary was the entry point. Satellite imagery had identified it as a concrete-lined channel approximately 60 centimeters wide and 40 centimeters deep, carrying runoff from the facility's hardstand area under the perimeter fence through a culvert and out to a field drainage system. The culvert itself measured approximately 80 centimeters in diameter, enough for a man to move through prone, equipment compressed against his body, for approximately 12 meters before emerging inside the perimeter on the facility's eastern apron. 2 operators went first, then 2 more. The 5th and 6th were the last through, and the 6th operator was barely inside the culvert when the patrol deviation happened. The patrol, not scheduled to cover the eastern sector for another 17 minutes, turned toward the drainage area. The reason has never been officially confirmed. Russian sources offered nothing. The most plausible explanation, based on timing and patrol behavior analysis, is a random compliance check of a sensor that had registered a minor anomaly, possibly triggered by one of the operators moving through the culvert. Whatever the reason, 4 soldiers and a dog were now walking toward a drainage ditch, where 5 GUR operators were pressed flat into 6 inches of cold runoff water, and the 6th was partially through a culvert under the perimeter fence. What would you have done in that moment? As the team leader, listening to boots on gravel getting closer, with 6 lives and 4 months of intelligence work in your hands and no option to retreat? Drop your answer in the comments. We read every one of them. The 6th operator completed the transit and pressed into the ditch. The team held. No movement, no communication, no sound. The dog, an important detail because dogs detect by scent and sound as much as movement, approached within an estimated 8 to 10 meters, then turned. The patrol continued on its deviation path, looped around the northern edge of the facility, and eventually returned to its scheduled pattern. 22 minutes after the deviation began, the eastern sector was clear. The team had 11 minutes to reach their objectives, plant 3 sets of charges, and begin movement toward the extraction corridor. 11 minutes. because the next scheduled patrol cycle would bring a team back through the eastern sector at 3:45 a.m. and the charges needed to be set before that window closed. This is where the operational planning reveals its depth. The target package had identified 3 specific destruction objectives inside the facility, each selected not just for physical effect, but for the permanence of the damage. First, the drone assembly and preloading line, a dedicated workspace where Shahed airframes were prepared for launch, fitted with warheads and staged for delivery to dispersed launch sites. Destroying the assembly line meant destroying the facility's ability to reconstitute operations quickly. This was not a warehouse of finished drones, but a production and preparation line, and damaging Russian operational tempo for weeks. Second, the fuel storage infrastructure, a cluster of underground tanks, supplying both the facility's generator systems and the propellant used in Shahed propulsion systems. Secondary explosions from fuel storage would be catastrophic and self-sustaining. The fire would do more damage than the initial charges. Third, the command relay antenna array on the facility's southern edge, the actual communications hub that made this depot a Shahed coordination facility, rather than just a storage point. Without the antenna array, the facility could not route targeting data, could not manage jamming windows, could not coordinate timing across attack vectors. Destroying the antenna array was destroying the facility's functional identity. Shaped charges for all 3 objectives had been prepped and were being carried into the facility by pairs of operators, each pair responsible for one objective. The sequence had been rehearsed. The timing between charge placement and extraction was calculated to the minute. What nobody expected was that the most significant payload inside the facility was not in the target package at all. How many Shahed airframes were destroyed in the secondary explosions triggered by this operation? A, approximately 20, B, approximately 34, or C, approximately 47? Keep that number in mind. The answer comes at the end of this video, and it matters more than just a statistic. The storage bay on the facility's western side had not been a primary intelligence focus. Imagery analysis had characterized it as a general logistics space, consistent with the facility's civilian logistics cover. What was actually inside it, as the secondary explosion sequence would later reveal, was a full staging inventory of preloaded Shahed airframes, drones already fitted with warheads, already programmed with route packages, staged and ready for distribution to launch sites within hours. The facility was not just a coordination hub, it was a forward magazine, and nobody outside that building knew what was in it until it burned. The first shaped charge detonated at 3:32 a.m., the assembly line. The concussion rolled across the facility, shattering windows in the administrative section and triggering the Russian security response immediately. Within seconds, the second charge, fuel storage, detonated, and the difference between a controlled demolition and a catastrophe became apparent. Fuel storage explosions do not behave like shaped charge detonations. They cascade, they pressure feed adjacent systems. The underground tanks ruptured sequentially over approximately 90 seconds, each rupture feeding the next, and the fireball that rose above the facility was visible from the Crimean city of Simferopol, 50 kilometers to the south. The third charge, the antenna array, detonated 40 seconds later, a comparatively modest event against the backdrop of what was already burning, but surgically precise. The relay antenna collapsed. Its base electronics were consumed in the fire that was already spreading across the facility's southern edge. The team was already moving toward the extraction corridor when the western storage bay detonated. Nobody had placed a charge there. The storage bay detonated because the fuel fire from the underground tank rupture had spread through a shared drainage line to the western section of the facility, where it found preloaded Shahed propellant in quantities no one on the Ukrainian planning team had known were there. The resulting explosion was the largest single detonation of the night, significantly larger than any of the 3 placed charges, and it triggered a sequential burn through the entire staged inventory of drone airframes, warheads, propellant, electronics, all of it. The facility burned for 4 hours. The team cleared the perimeter through the drainage corridor, recovered the ATVs at the 2-kilometer staging point, and moved northeast along the radar shadow toward the extraction point. 6 operators, 0 casualties. The operation was complete by 45 a.m. Here is what the raid on Dzhankoi tells us about this phase of the war, and it's worth saying plainly. Ukrainian special operations capability has matured to a level that Russian military planners have systematically failed to account for. The tactical planning that produced this operation, the 4 months of target development, the asset network inside occupied Crimea, the real-time redirect of an active team to a new objective, the drainage corridor identification, the charge placement sequence designed to produce cascading secondary effects. This is not improvisation. This is doctrine. Ukraine has developed a systematic methodology for deep penetration infrastructure denial that the Russian military, despite its extensive security apparatus, has not found an effective counter to. That is not a minor observation. It is a structural statement about the balance of special operations capability in this conflict. Here's the take that will probably generate some disagreement. Russian military intelligence failure at Dzhankoi is not primarily a tactical failure. It is a systemic failure of threat assessment doctrine. Russian force protection planning for the facility was built around a model of Ukrainian special operations capability that was accurate for 2022. Individual cell operations with limited coordination, short dwell times inside occupied territory, missions measured in hours rather than weeks. By May 2026, that model was 3 years obsolete. The security architecture at Dzhankoi, 3 rotating guard teams, layered radar coverage, a civilian cover story, was designed to defeat a threat profile that no longer existed. Ukrainian GUR had quietly become something categorically different from what Russian operational planners were defending against. The S-300 coverage was real. The patrol schedule was rigorous. The civilian cover was credible. None of it mattered because the threat had evolved past the defenses, without anyone in Russian military intelligence apparently noticing. That is not a small failure. That is an intelligence doctrine collapse. But the operation's most significant consequence is not what burned at Dzhankoi on the night of May 13. It is what didn't happen in the nights that followed. Drone defense operators along the Ukrainian front line, at air defense positions, protecting major population centers, measure their operational tempo and intercepts, the number of incoming threats engaged per night. For the 6 weeks prior to the Dzhankoi operation, that tempo had been relentlessly high. Coordinated saturation attacks, unpredictable vector rotation, precisely timed jamming windows, suppressing radar at critical moments, all of it characteristic of a network operating with sophisticated central coordination. The attacks were not stopping Ukrainian air defense. Patriot systems, paired with NASAMS batteries and supplemented by Ukrainian developed electronic warfare platforms, were maintaining intercept rates that Ukrainian officials characterized as operationally acceptable. But operationally acceptable at sustained high tempo is grinding. Operators fatigue, equipment cycles accelerate, and there is always the statistical reality that no intercept rate is 100%, which means every night of sustained high tempo attack is another night where some number of Shaheds reach their targets. Ukrainian drone defense operators noted the change within 48 hours of the Dzhankoi strike. Attack frequency dropped. Vector coordination deteriorated. The characteristic unpredictability that had been the operational signature of the coordinated network reverted to simpler, more predictable patterns. Saturation timing lost the precise synchronization that had been forcing Ukrainian air defense to commit assets to feints before the main body arrived. An analyst at a Ukrainian Air Defense Coordination Center, speaking to domestic media 3 weeks after the operation, described the change simply. The nights got quieter. This is the actual measure of the Dzhankoi operation, not the footage of secondary explosions, not the Russian telegram channels acknowledging, minimally, a fire at a logistics facility in northern Crimea. Nothing more, because acknowledging anything more would require acknowledging that Ukrainian special forces had operated deep inside occupied Crimea, breached a hardened military facility, and walked out. The measure is the quieter nights. The measure is the restoration of some margin of operational breathing room for Ukrainian air defense systems that had been running at sustained high tempo against a coordinated network. the measure is what didn't happen. Ukrainian drone footage released in the days following the operation showed the facility in aerial thermal imagery, the main structure entirely consumed, the antenna array a collapsed frame, and the western storage bay still radiating heat consistent, with ongoing subsurface burning 36 hours after the initial detonation. The scale of the secondary explosion damage in the western bay was substantially larger than the initial GUR damage assessment had anticipated, because that assessment had not known about the staged inventory of preloaded airframes. The discovery, visible in post-strike imagery analysis, prompted a revision of the intelligence picture for similar facilities across Crimea. Forward staging of completed Shahed inventories, a logistics pattern designed to minimize transfer time between coordination hub and launch site, had apparently become standard practice at multiple facilities. The Dzhankoi strike had illuminated a pattern that the pre-mission intelligence had not captured. I spent hours going through the post-mission assessment documents that have become partially available through Ukrainian defense, briefings and open-source analysis, and one detail kept coming back to me. The drainaged corridor that provided both the entry and exit point for the operation had been identified 6 weeks before the mission in satellite. Imagery analysis, specifically by a targeting analyst who noticed an anomaly in the thermal runoff signature of the eastern perimeter, suggesting an underground channel that standard topographic mapping of the area did not indicate. That analyst flagged it as a potential vulnerability in the facility's perimeter integrity. 6 weeks later, 6 operators went through it. The distance between a satellite imagery anomaly and an operator pressing through a culvert in freezing water is not a distance that most people ever think about, but that is how this kind of operation actually works. Patient accumulation of information, most of which never becomes operationally significant, until suddenly one detail becomes the difference between a mission and no mission at all. Subscribe to Steelfront if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Not the missile counts and territory maps, but the intelligence cycles and the drainage ditches. The Russian response to the Dzhankoi strike has been characteristically opaque, but what can be assessed from open sources and Ukrainian defense reporting is instructive. Within 72 hours of the strike, the Russian military security apparatus in Crimea initiated an expanded asset review process across all classified facilities in the district and internal investigation attempting to identify how Ukrainian intelligence had achieved the level of detail necessary to plan the operation. The investigation initially focused on the possibility of electronic penetration, a compromised communications channel or network intrusion, before eventually refocusing on human intelligence. The facility's civilian contractors, logistics personnel, and maintenance staff were all subjected to security review. Several were detained for questioning. The investigation, as of the time of this analysis, has not produced publicly attributed results, which is itself information. It suggests that the human intelligence network that supported the operation was either not discovered or not fully identified. This matters operationally, because it means the network that made Dzhankoi possible is likely still functioning, which means the intelligence cycle that produced one operation can produce the next one. Russian efforts to restore Shahed coordination capability in Crimea following the Dzhankoi strike have been documented through subsequent satellite, imagery, and signal intelligence. A replacement relay installation was apparently established at a separate location, more dispersed, more hardened, and notably without the civilian logistics cover that had characterized the Dzhankoi hub. The operational lessons were incorporated, in other words, but the timeline required to restore even partial coordination capability was measured in weeks, not days, and the interim period of degraded attack sophistication was operationally significant for Ukrainian air defense. Every week of reduced coordination tempo is a week where Ukrainian air defense systems recover cycle time, operators rest, and maintenance backlogs clear. The Dzhankoi operation did not end the Shahed threat. Nothing short of a comprehensive denial of Iranian drone supply chains to Russia would accomplish that. And those supply chains, despite sustained international diplomatic pressure, continued functioning through mid-2026. What the operation accomplished was a specific, measurable degradation of the coordination capability that had been amplifying the effectiveness of that threat. A degradation that cost 6 operators 22 minutes in a drainage ditch and produced 4 hours of fire and weeks of quieter nights. Put yourself in the shoes of the GUR team leader for a moment. Not the moment in the drainage ditch, but the moment 24 hours earlier when the redirect order arrived. A new target, 48 hours, a target package you've never seen before, on a facility you've never physically approached. Your team is already inside occupied territory. Your extraction is planned for a different direction. And somewhere in Kyiv, an analyst is showing your commander satellite imagery of a facility that is right now routing the attack packages that will kill Ukrainian civilians tonight and tomorrow night and every night until someone does something about it. Would you take the redirect? Think about that before you answer, and tell us in the comments what you would have done. The Dzhankoi facility, as reconstructed from post-strike analysis and the partial information available through Ukrainian defense briefings, represented a specific evolution in Russian drone warfare infrastructure worth examining closely, because understanding what it was explains why destroying it mattered beyond the immediate operational effect. When Iran first supplied Shahed 136 airframes to Russia in 2022, the operational model was relatively simple: launch sites, pre-programmed routes, mass saturation. The drones themselves were not sophisticated. The Shahed 136 is essentially a one-way attack loitering munition, with a relatively simple inertial navigation system, a cruise speed in the 180 km/h range, and a warhead effective against soft targets and urban infrastructure. What made them effective was not individual capability, but aggregate numbers. Dozens per night, unpredictable timing, no practical cost ceiling on the attacker's side. A Shahed 136 costs approximately $20,000 to $30,000 per unit, while a Patriot missile costs approximately $4 million per intercept. The economic asymmetry was built into the threat model. By 2025, however, the operational model had evolved significantly. The Dzhankoi facility represented the mature version of that evolution. A network architecture that transformed individual Shahed launches from a mass saturation tactic into a coordinated multi-vector operation. Instead of dozens of drones launched from a single site on a direct route, the network routed attacks from multiple geographically dispersed sites on coordinated vectors, timing their arrivals to force Ukrainian air defense into sequential engagement sequences rather than simultaneous ones. Simultaneously, the network managed jamming assets to suppress Ukrainian radar at precisely calculated moments in the intercept timeline. The result was an attack architecture substantially more effective per airframe than the 2022 model, which is why, despite Ukrainian air defense improvements, attack effectiveness had been increasing rather than decreasing through late 2025 and early 2026. The Dzhankoi hub was the infrastructure that made that architecture function. Without it, the dispersed launch sites reverted to independent operation, still dangerous, but dramatically less coordinated, falling back essentially to the 2022 operational model, which is exactly what post-strike analysis of attack patterns showed. Here is what this tells us about how this war is being fought, and it is worth saying directly. The most strategically significant actions in this conflict are increasingly not the ones that produce dramatic footage. A T-80 burning on a Ukrainian steppe road produces footage. A drainage ditch in Crimea does not. But the drainage ditch produces results the burning tank cannot. It degrades the system, not just the platform. Ukrainian military planning has internalized this distinction in a way that reflects a sophisticated understanding of network warfare, and the GUR operations capability that produces missions like Dzhankoi is the operational expression of that understanding. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine targets systems. The 6 operators who held motionless in that drainage ditch for 22 minutes, while a dog passed 8 meters away, were not just destroying a facility, they were degrading an architecture. And the architects in Russian military planning, who built that architecture around the assumption that it was safe inside occupied Crimea, now have to rebuild it knowing that the assumption was wrong. If you believe tactics was wars, type Steel Front in the comments. The Dzhankoi operation was not an isolated event. It was one operation in a systematic campaign that Ukrainian military intelligence has been conducting against Russian rear area infrastructure throughout the occupied territories, with a specific focus on Crimea as the logistical backbone of Russian operations in the south. Since October 2025, GUR attributed operations in Crimea have targeted a pattern of facilities that, when mapped together, reveals a coherent strategic logic, not the dramatic headline-generating strikes against naval assets or air defense systems that characterized earlier phases of the campaign, but a quieter, more sustained effort to degrade the enabling infrastructure that Russian forces in the south depend on: fuel distribution nodes, communications relay facilities, ammunition pre-positioning depots, command coordination centers. Each target individually significant, but also contributing to a cumulative degradation of Russian operational capacity in the south that is, by early 2026, measurable in Russian operational tempo and sustainment metrics. The Kerch Bridge, the massive infrastructure link connecting Crimea to mainland Russia that had been Ukraine's most visible Crimean target in earlier phases of the war, remains functionally operational, but at significantly reduced capacity due to accumulated damage and defensive restrictions imposed by Russian operators fearful of additional strikes. The reduction in Kerch Bridge throughput has forced Russian logistics planners to diversify their supply chains, which has introduced inefficiencies, transit time extensions, and additional exposure points that GUR's targeting cycle has been systematically exploiting. The bridge is not Ukraine's primary target anymore. The vulnerabilities that the bridge's reduced capacity has created are. This is the operational context in which the Dzhankoi mission took place. Not a single brilliant stroke, but one precisely executed component of a sustained campaign with coherent strategic logic. The campaign's goal is not to retake Crimea through direct military action. That is a political and operational question that operates on a completely different timeline and force balance calculation. The campaign's goal is to make Crimea expensive, to make every Russian military capability hosted in Crimea operate at degraded efficiency, with higher sustainment costs, under constant uncertainty about whether the facility it's operating from will still be there tomorrow. To transform Crimea from a secure sanctuary into a contested operational environment, even without a single Ukrainian soldier crossing the isthmus. 6 men in a drainage ditch are doing that, one operation at a time. The aftermath of the Dzhankoi strike produced one more data point worth examining in detail. Ukrainian drone footage released in the days following the operation, almost certainly captured by a reconnaissance UAV, positioned to observe the facility following the strike, showed not just the burning facility, but the Russian emergency response to it. Fire suppression assets, security vehicles, and what appears to be a command vehicle consistent with a district military commander's were all visible in the footage. More significantly, the footage showed no organized military security cordon around the facility's perimeter until approximately 45 minutes after the first detonation. For 45 minutes, the most sensitive classified facility in Dzhankoi district was burning, with its preloaded Shahed inventory detonating in sequential secondary explosions before a competent military security response arrived. 45 minutes. 3 guard teams rotating on 15-minute cycles, and it took 45 minutes to establish a security perimeter after the facility was already in flames. The Russian telegram channels eventually acknowledged a fire at a logistics facility. No mention of the cause. No mention of the drone inventory. No mention of the team that had been standing in that facility at 3:32 a.m. placing shaped charges while the guard rotation cycled 40 meters away. The information management was competent. The security management had been anything but. What would NATO have done differently in constructing the security architecture for a facility like this? Think about redundant sensor systems, randomized patrol timing, standoff detection for low signature approach vectors, Comment your tactical analysis below. Now, the quiz answer. How many Shahed airframes were destroyed in the secondary explosions at Dzhankoi? Based on post-strike damage assessment conducted through thermal imagery analysis, Ukrainian defense sources estimate that approximately 34 preloaded Shahed 136 airframes were destroyed in the Western Storage Bay detonation sequence. That is the B answer. Approximately 34 airframes. The estimate is derived from the thermal signature and explosive yield of the secondary detonation sequence cross-referenced against known Shahed 136 airframe dimensions and the assessed internal volume of the Western Storage Bay. At a cost of approximately $20,000 to $30,000 per airframe, the destroyed inventory represented between 680,000 and just over $1 million in Russian drone capacity. In addition to the facility infrastructure itself, which Ukrainian defense analysis estimated at a replacement cost of approximately $12 to $15 million when all relay electronics, assembly equipment, and hardened structural elements are included. Total assessed Russian loss from the Dzhankoi operation, somewhere between $13 and $16 million in infrastructure and equipment. Operational disruption to Shahed coordination capability, assessed at 4 to 6 weeks of degraded operational tempo, with full restoration of equivalent capability requiring additional time for construction, testing, and operational integration at a replacement facility. Ukrainian cost, 6 operators and a window of 22 minutes in a drainage ditch. That exchange rate is the story. That exchange rate is what modern Ukrainian special operations actually looks like when it functions correctly. It is not spectacular. It does not produce the footage that drives YouTube view counts in the short term. What it produces is measurable strategic effect at minimal cost, executed with precision that reflects years of capability development, intelligence investment, and operational learning. That is the war that Ukraine is actually fighting in 2026. Not just in the armored battles on the Eastern Front that produce the dramatic imagery, but in the drainage ditches of Crimea where 6 people hold still for 22 minutes and then burn a hub to the ground. The lessons here are direct and should be stated plainly. For Ukrainian operations, target selection has matured beyond platforms to systems. The Dzhankoi facility was not a tank or a gun or a drone. It was a node in an architecture. Destroying the node degraded the architecture. This is 21st century force application at its most effective. Economical, precise, strategically weighted, and denial-focused rather than attrition-focused. Every operation that follows this logic multiplies its effect beyond the immediate physical damage. For Russian defensive doctrine, security architecture built around historical threat assessment fails against an enemy that is learning faster than the assessment updates. 3 guard teams, S-300 coverage and civilian cover were real defensive investments, and they were defeated by a drainage corridor, electric ATVs, and 22 minutes of absolute stillness. The gap was not in the defenses themselves, but in the threat model the defenses were designed against. Defending against what an enemy was, instead of what they have become, is a failure mode that the Russian military continues to repeat at cost. For the broader war, Crimea is not a sanctuary. This is the strategic message of the Dzhankoi operation and every GUR attributed operation that preceded and will follow it. Russian military planners who positioned high-value coordination infrastructure in Crimea on the assumption that distance, occupation, and layered air defense made it secure have been systematically disabused of that assumption since 2022. The disabusing continues, the drainage ditch continues, the nights continue to get quieter. Was the GUR's decision to redirect an active team on 48-hour notice the right call? The operation succeeded, but what if the deviation hadn't resolved? What if the dog had detected the team? The decision to commit an already active unit to a new objective with minimal preparation time is a calculated risk that could have ended very differently. That is worth thinking about. Could Russian military intelligence have prevented this? Probably yes, but it would have required a fundamental revision of their threat assessment doctrine. And revising threat assessment doctrine is precisely the kind of institutional self-examination that hierarchical military organizations do poorly. until a catastrophic failure forces it. The catastrophic failure at Dzhankoi may be that forcing event, or it may not be. That is what makes it worth watching. What would you have done differently? As the Russian facility commander, knowing now that your security architecture had a drainage corridor vulnerability. Or as the GUR mission planner, working with 48 hours and incomplete intelligence on a target your team had never seen. Both questions have real answers. Both answers say something about how this war is being fought and how it will continue to be fought. Will a facility like Dzhankoi be rebuilt and operational again within 6 months? Comment yes or no. And if you've analyzed similar force protection patterns in the Crimea theater, tell us what you think the replacement architecture looks like. Subscribe to Steel Front, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The steppe north of Dzhankoi is quiet now. The logistics depot shell stands, partially collapsed where the western bay detonated. The antenna mast frame still visible against the sky, listing at an angle that suggests the base electronics are gone. But the structure was never fully removed. Russian military engineers assessed it for restoration. The assessment came back negative. The facility will not be rebuilt at this location. Whatever replaces it will be elsewhere, more dispersed, harder to find, harder to approach, which means the intelligence cycle starts again. Which means GUR analysts are already looking at satellite imagery, counting thermal anomalies, tracking signal intercepts, and looking for drainage corridors. The wrecks remain, the quiet nights remain, and somewhere in occupied Crimea, 6 men who held still for 22 minutes are already on the next mission. Real tactics, real consequences, Steel Front.